We've been very blessed to have both Dr. Pangestu and Taimur Baig with us earlier last year. I must say with Taimur that at the year start in 2020, none of us saw this coming. And it must teach us a certain degree of humility, but also the ability to respond and learn new things. And one of the new things that we've had to learn is much more about pandemics and the responses. And that's where I'm really indebted to Dr. Tikki Pangestu, who has really shared not just with the SIIA and me, but so many people in Singapore and elsewhere. His vast experience in handling the work of the WHO for many years. And we are, I think, at an interesting new juncture. Again, with humility of not knowing what we don't know, we seem to be at a time where, despite differences how we've handled the pandemic so far, the now emphasis everyone agrees on is vaccines. But again, from my perspective, the pace and quality of that push out on vaccines is differing. In Singapore, things seem to be moving quite quickly given our small population and a degree of organization. But the picture may be less pretty elsewhere. In fact, globally, we're warned that there's a bit of a scramble with, again, the rich countries and the rich in the rich countries getting access while people at the bottom and poorer countries, developing countries, will struggle. That's one of the big issues, I think, of where the fight against COVID pandemic is morphing, it's changing perhaps to a new phase. And how will this situation and changes affect the global connections and the economic questions? I think this is the second major part, because the pandemic has not only been a health impact, it's been one of the largest economic impacts ever. We're talking about global sort of recession scale impacts, larger than the global financial crisis. That's where I hope I will continue to learn from Taimur Baig and his comments. The announcement not only of the Singapore budget, but efforts to pump some of the economies around the region will be things I hope to hear from Taimur. But let me begin by asking Dr. Pangestu. She's been well introduced by Sarah, so I won't do that again. But if I may ask Dr. Pangestu to share with us, where does he think we are in terms of the pandemic and the vaccine situation? How much control can we expect to see coming over the situation health-wise within the next 6 or 9 months? How much visibility do you think we have?
Okay, thank you very much, Simon, for this opportunity to speak. I'm going to address 3 questions. The first one is around the distribution of COVID-19 vaccines and the public's reaction, both in Singapore and in other countries. The reality is that there are currently about 7 vaccine candidates with another 50 in the pipeline. And the latest is 200 million doses of vaccines as of today have been administered globally. That's pretty impressive. Singapore has administered about 250,000 and hopes to vaccinate an additional 1 million by April of this year. Globally, Israel, as we all probably know, leads with having 49% of their population having received the first dose. The UK, 1/3 of their population, and Australia is aiming for 4 million by March. However, there are still big challenges, and let me just enumerate them. The first one is unequal vaccine access. 45% of the vaccines that have been deployed so far are in the developed countries. The developing countries lagging far behind. The second challenge is limited supply of the vaccine. And this is partly due to production limitations, but also this issue of vaccine nationalism. Developed countries sort of hoarding vaccines in a way, keeping stocks which is far in excess of what they actually need. And this has resulted in many developing countries actually trying to develop their own vaccines to maintain self-sufficiency. Indonesia, Thailand, India, China are developing their own domestic vaccines. So that's the second challenge, limited supply. The third challenge is obviously the well-known one of logistics and delivery challenges. Some of the vaccines, as we know, require very low storage temperatures, and that cold chain facility is quite limited in many developing countries. The fourth, and probably in my view, the biggest challenge is vaccine hesitancy. Misinformation, conspiracy theories, propaganda has resulted in many countries, populations actually not willing to actually receive the vaccine. So that's the fourth. The fifth challenge, I believe, is something around moral, legal, and ethical issues. How do you balance the steps to resume public life or the economy with sensitive issues such as individual rights, free choice, obligations, the public safety or the greater good, okay, discrimination, privacy, all these issues are coming up. A lot of countries are thinking of mandatory or compulsory vaccination. Is getting vaccinated a moral duty? That's a tough question. It's a slippery slope. So those are the big challenges that face the deployment of the vaccines. Much hope, as you know, is being pinned on COVAX, the global initiative led by the WHO to ensure equitable distribution of vaccines to developing countries. But the initiative is sputtering a little bit, mainly because it doesn't really have enough money, enough resources. Um, Unfortunately, I've seen a projection that at current rate of vaccination, it will take 7 years before the pandemic ends. That's pretty depressing. Um, just a final comment in terms of public reaction, okay, to accept the vaccines. This relates to what I said before about hesitancy. I think the public reaction was quite positive in many Asian countries initially, but this willingness to take the vaccine has actually dropped since November of last year. This is a recent survey, and as we know, several countries have seen escalating anti-vaccine protests, for example, in US and Australia. But a recent study on a positive note suggested that overall vaccine confidence is higher compared to the end of last year. In the UK, this one survey suggested that 78% are willing to accept, 67% in Denmark, but only about 44% in France. So that's the first issue on distribution of vaccines. The second issue I've been asked to address is the issue of the new infectious COVID-19 variants from the UK and South Africa. Should we worry? The reality is, I'm trained as a microbiologist. The reality is that viruses mutate all the time, and it's the SARS-CoV-2 virus is no exception. These mutations may be neutral, beneficial, or even harmful to the virus. I think the bottom line, though, is what I've seen so far in terms of the evidence is that most of the vaccines are able to protect against these variants, at least with the UK variant, but maybe with some reduced protection against the South African and the Brazil variant. However, I think I need to emphasize that despite a potentially reduced efficacy against some of these variants, the key finding is that the vaccines still protect against severe disease, hospitalizations, and death, because at the end of the day, that is really the main cause for concern. Also, I think on the R&D side, companies are developing booster doses or second doses that will include the current and the emerging variants. The technology is such that they can do this now very rapidly. Within 6 weeks, they can change the composition of the vaccine. So this is standard practice, as we know, for the annual flu vaccinations. So I don't believe there's real cause for concern, but I think continuous monitoring and research is needed, especially genomic sequencing surveillance in order to rapidly detect these new variants. So that's the second question. The third question I was asked to address is, are there examples of takeaways from fresh outbreaks and new lockdowns in countries? As we have seen, fresh outbreaks continue to occur, but there seems to be, just in the last 3 or 4 days, data is coming up, that there is an overall and significant reduction in the number of cases. The number of reported global weekly cases is falling and has dropped nearly 50% this year, 2021. And there's also reduction in fatality and rates. So what may be some of the takeaways? I think targeted, rather, the first takeaway is that targeted and rather than general lockdowns seem to be working well. Secondly, the campaign to promote safe distancing, mask wearing, avoiding large gatherings seems to be working, better acceptance and compliance. Thirdly, the biological fact is that as the pandemic expands and spreads, viruses will eventually run out of susceptible people to infect as more people have been exposed to the virus. There is something called the reproductive number, and this for the UK seems to have dropped below 1, which is very promising. The fourth takeaway is that obviously the vaccines, okay, as they become more widely deployed, the transmission and spread of the virus will be reduced. And as I said before, the number of severe cases that require hospitalization and the number of deaths are going also to be reduced. So those are sort of the four takeaways. But let me just emphasize, okay, maybe there is light at the end of the tunnel, so to speak, but the vaccine is not a magic bullet. I think it's important that we continue to stay vigilant and continue those proven public health practices, mask, social distancing, avoiding crowds, to make sure that the light at the end of the tunnel is not an oncoming train. Thank you, Simon.
Thank you, Dr. Pangestu. Pangestu, may I ask you one question before we get to Taimur? You said the light at the end of the tunnel is coming. So not at the end of the tunnel per se, but you can see the light. Looking up that light, about 9 months, do you think there will be a significant difference in the way the region and Singapore looks, given the
I think, Simon, I think this really relates closely to the deployment of the vaccine. Okay, and talking specifically about the region, it's obviously lagging behind the developed countries like the US and the UK and Israel. But if the deployment can be ramped up quickly, you're talking about 9 months, I definitely see the situation significantly improving.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's go on to Taimur, and then we'll come back to you and Taimur together during question and answer. Taimur, you have some slides to show, and I meant it sort of sincerely that you, like all of us, really didn't see this coming. But I know that you've been thinking quite deeply about this and been responding to it. I look forward to your view about what is happening for economically in the months to come. Please.
Thanks very much, Simon. Great to be back at SIIA. It's been a while. I guess the last time we did this was in person. I long for those days, hopefully before this year is over. And I share Professor Pangestu's optimism that if we do indeed ramp up vaccination, even if we can't let the rest of the world come to Singapore, but we can move around Singapore a little more freely. Okay, so I will share a few slides, and just to riff on what Professor Pangestu just talked about, I'll just add a couple of numbers and then add a little more flavor to the salient points that he had made. So this is as of last night. Singapore is a bit of a laggard compared to the Americans and the Europeans and Israel. Israel, of course, is the shining beacon in the world right now. 82% of Israeli population, not the Arabs in Israel, but the Israelis have been vaccinated, and of which, as of yesterday, 33.5% of them have also received the second dose. In the UK, as you can see, the focus has been on just getting the first dose out as much as possible. So there's a huge gap between first dose, which is more than a quarter of the population, and second dose, which is not even 1% of the population. Then you have the US. Again, about a quarter of that 20% of the Americans who have gotten the first dose have also now received their second dose. It doesn't really matter in the case of China because Chinese vaccines are single dose. So therefore, that 2.9% is it for China. But look at the big humanity out there, billion plus population in India, close to 300 million in Indonesia, less than 1% vaccinated so far. And the second dose number is basically, epsilon. It doesn't really matter anymore. And then there's Singapore, where I suppose there isn't that much urgency given the very low number of incidences locally, and hence so far only 4.5% of the population vaccinated, with about 2% of the population getting a second dose. Hopefully will ramp up. Hopefully the next time we have a discussion like this in a couple of months' time will be in the 20s and 30s. But so far, Singapore is certainly not in the top tier of global economies in terms of rolling out the vaccine. You heard Professor Pangestu talk about that, vaccination is not the only story. We have to sort of keep an eye on infection. And this is a good way of looking at the spread of infection. First, bunch of Asian economies. On the horizontal axis, you have the stock of cases, total number of cases. So a country like India, for example, exceeded 10 million cases about a month and a half ago. And on the vertical axis is the last 5 days summation, so the moving average or moving aggregate of the number of cases in the last 5 days. So good news is a country like India, the worst seems to be behind. The number of infection has sort of ebbed. The multiple variants and strains that have been sort of, causing headaches around the world so far seem not to be an issue in India, but do not get too confident. My personal anecdotal understanding is that hospitals are getting pressure again in India, and in the coming days, we might see that dip turn into an incline because I'm seeing in large metropolitan areas in India, especially in the last 48 to 72 hours, again, the incidence of cases seem to be increasing. And this is a classic example of a country where things were good for a while, and then people sort of let their guards down, and then it spreads like wildfire. In the rest of Asia, I think the two really bad stories are, of course, Indonesia and the Philippines, where both the stock and the flow of cases still remain very large, and we have barely begun to see some easing around the edges, but still, in terms of daily incidence of cases, in terms of total stock of cases, these are the two big leaders in Asia after India. Then we have the good stories in Asia, where after sort of, few scares here and there, countries like Singapore, South Korea, Vietnam have seen, very well contained virus situation. South Korea has had a few alarms here and there and has led to repeated shutdowns of the economy. But again, when you talked about, global numbers, these numbers in Asia are not even a fraction of what you see in the Western Hemisphere. Then there's a case of Singapore, which for a while looked pretty alarming, at least its journey from 0 to 10,000 cases. Since then, Singapore got very serious and have managed to bring down the number of cases substantially. But then you look at a country like Thailand, the blue line on the screen, and it tells you how challenging it is, even in a country where vaccination, even before vaccination, the pandemic seemed to be somewhat under management. It came down sharply, it went up, it came down, went up, came down. So we have seen squiggles and W's in the case of Thailand repeatedly, causing quite a bit of fear. And true to form, just in the last few weeks, as the number of cases have come down, everybody in Thailand seems to think that the pandemic is over and things are easing. And again, I would urge anybody associated with Thailand not to take it easy. And the same thing that we are about to see in India might even happen in the case of Thailand, where we see cases go up again. What about the rest of the world? Well, in the US, the last month or so has been encouraging. The huge winter spike that we saw, which was threatening to take the US to 20 million cases by now, has ebbed a bit, although still certainly by and far the leader in the world in terms of daily incidence of infection. The rate of infection has come down a bit, and with encouraging vaccination, hopefully things will be getting a little better. And there are some immunologists out there who say that if you did a proper serology study in the US, the number is not like 15 million, it's probably 100 million by now. So US might be heading toward herd immunity before anybody else, simply because there's just so much asymptomatic infection spreading through that country. And then we have a couple of other cases where, just like the case we saw in Malaysia and Thailand and South Korea, that you have a spike, then softening up, and then again spike again. Most notable of that would be France, where things seem to come down a bit during the summer. They let their guards down, and it's been really, really tough there. And the political economy of dealing with the management has become perhaps more challenging in France than anywhere else in the world right now. And then you see the black dotted line, which is Spain, which has sort of come down a bit again, but nowhere close to reaching the respite that Asian economies have sort of enjoyed in recent months. You heard Professor Pangestu talk about mutations and variations. So mutations are basically copying errors from an infected cell. whereas the variants are the ones that sort of share the same inherited set of mutations. There is also sort of lineage and strains, but I'm not going to get into all that stuff. But the bottom line is that we've got these three variants of concern right now. Some of them are quite infectious. And in the case of the US in particular, although I just showed you a chart which shows that the daily incidence of cases are ebbing, at the same time, that B117, the UK variant, it's doubling every 10 days in the US. So fingers crossed that that doesn't again become a big source of concern going forward. So I think that only major sort of question that we have with respect to COVID-19, you heard from Professor Pangestu that at the current rate, we might take more than half a decade to vaccinate the whole world. Well, the thing is that, vaccination probably gives you 7-8 months of, protection, and then what? So do we have to sort of, live with the COVID-19, take regular vaccines, and then, sort of have to maintain some degree of mobility restrictions to keep the disease at bay for years and years? Probably, and that's where the word endemic comes from. Can COVID-19 become an endemic illness in the world? And that, of course, has profound implications of never really going back to the pre-COVID days. Maybe we will all become like the Japanese, that wearing masks would be the norm, as opposed to something that we did in 2020 and 2021. All right, I want to talk a little bit about Singapore. Absolutely nothing to do with all the COVID-19 stuff that we've sort of talked about. We saw the budget come out last week. Deficit has, of course, come down substantially. So in this chart, you can see that we're going from double-digit deficit to just 2.2% of GDP deficit for 2021. The authorities are still extending significant amount of support to targeted households who need the support, as well as targeted sectors which are under a lot of pressure, particularly hospitality and tourism. But beyond that, some of the broad-based support measures that were in place last year, they're slowly being weaned out of the economy, and how the economy deals with that would be one question. But of course, we are looking at about 5%, 5.5% of rebound, if you would, in terms of growth after the depth of that 5.5% contraction last year. I like the fact that the budget is looking at widening the social safety net for Singaporeans, independent of the counter-cyclical measures that are in the budget. This has been something that's been going on for, I would say, 6-7 years, and we're gradually seeing sort of Singapore becoming more generous, more caring, more inclusive in terms of the social safety net measures, which I think is critically important for an economy that may be wealthy on aggregate, but does have huge amount of within society variation in terms of wealth per capita, as well as vulnerability of the elderly and those who may be at risk of their jobs being disrupted because of profound changes in technology. I really like the sustainability focus in the budget, particularly with respect to EV vehicles. Singapore has been a bit late coming to that party, but I think Singapore sometimes is late coming to some parties, but then it really knows how to party. So we are beginning to see very ambitious plans in terms of rolling out charging infrastructure, in terms of raising the duty on petroleum, as well as providing tax rebates for people who want to buy EV vehicles. So let Tesla become ubiquitous in Singapore in the coming years. I want to talk a little bit about markets and economies, because while we have to worry about COVID, we have to worry about what's happening in the budget, there are some truly bizarre things happening in global markets right now, which sooner or later will have spillover effects in our day-to-day lives sitting here in Singapore or Southeast Asia. So before we go into the markets, let's keep in mind that the rebound that we're seeing this year does not equate to recovery. They're very different concepts. The huge decline in GDP and loss of livelihoods that we saw in 2020, even if by virtue of arithmetic, countries report pleasing growth numbers in 2021, we are nowhere close to going back to trend. So what you see in this chart is levels of real GDP of a variety of economies. And with the exception of China, virtually nobody is going back to trend even in the next couple of years. In fact, if you think about ASEAN 5, starting from 2018, by the time the dust settles at the end of 2022, we're talking about 2.5% growth per year on average, which is of course significantly below par for the region used to 4, 5, 6% growth. In the case of India, again, a country that aspires to grow at 7, 8% a year, there will be cumulative growth in real GDP of 14% over 4 years. So we're again talking about significantly subpar growth, massive divergence from the trend that one had in mind 4 or 5 years ago, and that is being set back and scarred by this crisis as we speak. And then if you think about a country like Japan or Euro area, we're talking about a lost half a decade already, if not more. And these are the optimistic assumptions around the latest World Economic Outlook of the IMF. Okay, I said earlier that there are some really strange, troubling things happening. As I'm sure some of you have read the financial papers in recent months and seen that whether it is this issue of people in social media boosting a stock and causing spikes in volatility that normally are associated with deep financial crisis, or the phenomenon of special purpose acquisition vehicles, which are now dominating US initial public offering market more than actual capital market activity, or the fact that Bitcoin has gone from a few $1,000s to $55,000, or rather $50,000 this morning. So all sorts of things are happening. Some of these things are legacies of the easy money policy of the last decade, which then got turbocharged around the pandemic response. So we have a lot of liquidity. We have governments and monetary authorities trying to keep interest rates low for a very long time. There is no free lunch. They may keep rates low. They may keep indebted companies in business, but they will also invariably start creating huge distortions in financial markets, which may come back to haunt us sooner than later. So keep an eye on those things. Finally, issues related to inflation. A lot of chatter these days that the huge amount of fiscal stimulus that has been rolled out in 2020 and is being rolled out in 2021, if indeed we're beginning to see that light at the end of the tunnel that Professor Pangestu was talking about, wouldn't that then conspire to push up inflation substantially? So as you can see, inflation expectations markers are already looking at 2.5% inflation in the US, something that we haven't really expected for a while. In terms of commodity price inflation, we're also seeing some degree of buoyancy. So asset prices are up sharply. Some consumer prices will likely be up in the coming months. Keep an eye on that, something to worry about. Now, there are a lot of arguments that, are we really going to see some idiosyncratic pickup in inflation, or there's some substantive years of inflation ahead of us. And just like most economists, I'll give you arguments both in favor and against inflation. So on the cyclical side, certainly a lot of stars are aligning for an pickup in prices. We have a worldwide shortage of parts, particularly in semiconductor chips and autos, where supply chains are getting disrupted, and you might see some prices go up if demand comes back. Industrial metal demand out of China has picked up. That can again also have some sort of a galvanizing impact on the world of non-energy commodities. Fiscal stimulus I just talked about, and also in the shipping area, there's a bit of a supply-demand mismatch, and shipping costs have begun to soar. But these are the short-term drivers of inflation, and they may indeed keep some juice going in terms of price dynamics. But for the longer term, there are still many, many factors that will sort of tell us not to worry too much about inflation for the longer period. So there's still a lot of excess capacity in the energy sector. There's huge amount of adverse dynamic from the aging side in China, Japan, European Union. These are not inflationary developments. These are very deflationary developments. Technology, the last 30 years has shown us that is a very good stabilizer of prices, keeps on coming up with productivity gains that translate into stable or declining prices of a lot of things that we consume on a day-to-day basis. And finally, labor unions are not that strong in the US, in Asia, and therefore wages remain pretty flat. So this is a very big subject. I'm not going to delve too much into it, but I did think that it was sort of important to talk about it in the context of what's happening in the world. So I'll just stop sharing my slides right away.
Thank you very much, Taimur. I think you gave us not just immediate shorter-term analysis of what happens to the economy in the pandemic, but also other factors which are important to bear in mind. Sometimes the remedies economically have lead to further problems, and it's timely you close off on that issue. We're going to answer to question answer, and as Sarafim has suggested, we'd be happy to see you type up your questions or comments in the Q&A function so that we can digest them and respond to them as Taimur was saying, most efficiently. But allow me to just start us off with a question to each of them. First, if I could start with Dr. Pangestu. Tikki, with the different timelines you see in Asia and ASEAN, will it have an effect on our ability to work together? There is some talk about how, no one is safe until everyone is safe. And we know that ASEAN, our region, is one of the most intertwined. The people movement before the pandemic goods, so much thoroughfare all the time, especially through Singapore as one of the hubs. If Singapore is relatively efficient, but other countries, including Indonesia, sadly are not, would this have an effect on the overall sort of health scenario in ASEAN? That's my question to you. Taimur, if I could ask you first more narrowly on the pandemic and leave it to later to discuss the wider economic issues. Could I ask you the flip of that? You've pointed out very correctly that our expected new trajectory in ASEAN will be much more modest, 3%, 2.5%, about half of what it used to be. And, you know, as you and I know, that 3% compared to 6% is 100% less. I mean, 50% less. It's quite a big drop. But there are other people who say that with China's growth, China-ASEAN configuration will be even more logical. And so we will see much more linkages to China's economy as the only one that can really grow and is of global scale. So while we're waiting for questions to come in, I hope you might address that. First, Dr. Pangestu, Tikki, would you be able to address what you think of the different pace of change of vaccinations and safety of ASEAN as a group?
Yes, absolutely. I think you raised a very good point, because I think the ASEAN countries are really quite diverse in terms of their capacities, in terms of their resources, even in terms of their geographies, in terms of, you know, effectively dealing with the pandemic. You can't compare Singapore with Indonesia or with the Philippines. So in a sense, this will be a really wonderful test of the spirit of the ASEAN community. As you said, you know, until everyone is safe, no one is safe. So where would ASEAN community spirit come into this in the coming months? Would Singapore be able, for example, to show leadership in terms of coordinating support, in terms of having perhaps access vaccines that can be shared with other countries? There are so many dimensions of this. So, you know, sort of a collective action in the spirit of the ASEAN community will be absolutely critical. And don't forget also this issue of vaccine nationalism. I'm not going to pretend that at this point in time that the countries are completely open to helping others. I think, you know, they're going to be focused on taking care of their own populations first. So it's, how do you balance that, you know? But yes, absolutely. I think given the differences, the collaboration, the cooperation, the collective action is absolutely crucial.
Taimur, would you mind? There's a question that's popped up, and I think it relates very directly to what I asked Tikki. So in terms of flow, do you mind if I go first to Tikki again? This question from Mark, and he asked about realistically Singapore's vaccination, and therefore what is the likelihood of allowing easing travel policies into Singapore, you know, and reducing stay-at-home timeframes, etc. So it's quite specific to Singapore, but it does deal with that. You know, for example, at ASEAN level, we're talking about trying to find ways to reopen travel for people, and obviously, you know, that may be a pipe dream unless vaccinations allow countries to accept people with far less quarantine requirements. Tikki, do you have a view on Singapore's readiness to ease up?
From what I experienced myself when I came back about a month ago and had to undergo 2-week quarantine. Yes, it's tough. A lot of people are not happy, but it's what makes Singapore one of the safest countries in the world right now. And you know, if you look at the experience of other countries, the minute you relax travel restrictions, that's when you start having surges. So I personally don't see Singapore taking or moving away from this very cautious approach. And I think that's the right way to go. You can't hurry this, Simon. You know, things are still changing. Variants, as Taimur mentioned, are moving, are developing all the time. So to sort of relax too soon, I think that's asking for trouble.
Yeah, I think that is the prevailing answer. And I think Additionally, any relaxation might be very exceptional, for certain business groups. That's why the green lanes are supposed to be very controlled and limited. So if the questioner, Mark, was asking about more general policies for tourism or just simply, re-engaging your family, I'm afraid it doesn't seem to be at the top of the list right now.
Right.
Good. I'll come back to the pandemic questions a bit more, but I think, to be fair, can I move on to Taimur and ask him that question? I hope you can remember it, Taimur. I've almost forgotten it myself.
Do. Yeah. So, we run these what we call sort of growth regressions. What determines Vietnam or Indonesia or Thailand's long-term GDP growth? Is it global demand? Is it an oil shock? Is it partner country demand beyond just the global, but the ones that you really trade with? Is it China? And it seems to us that when you look at this regression analysis, if you will, over the last 2-3 decades, that the parameter estimate of China, as well as the statistical significance associated with that estimate of China, has gone up. So China matters today much more cyclically for ASEAN countries than it did even 10 years ago. So for example, during the global financial crisis, China was on a breakneck growth speed, but that didn't prevent the rest of ASEAN from falling deep into a funk because their main relationship for growth was non-China global demand. Today, things are different quite substantially, where Chinese demand for inputs and final demand into China are very substantial sources of growth dynamism for Asian economies. And hence, if China does manage to grow at this expected 7-8% in the course of 2021, we do expect some of that to spill over to Asia. However, ASEAN countries also benefit tremendously from Chinese travel. And that, unfortunately, is not coming back any soon. So the spillover will largely be through the supply chain, that if China is seeing huge demand for its products around the world, then the regional factories would be humming and they'd be sending those things out there. I think there is this one narrative out there that 4 years of trade war and the fact that China is aging and becoming more expensive would lead to this massive investment flow being diverted away from China into ASEAN, and ASEAN will become like a mini China. I think these are more statements of hope than reality. When you look at the Chamber of Commerce surveys in China of American companies, European companies, they are not saying that they're finding cost of production going up unbearably and that they are fundamentally changing their plans with respect to the China strategy. So yes, at the low end of the manufacturing spectrum, countries like Vietnam and Bangladesh have benefited from light manufacturing, some electronics and textile coming to their shores from China. But the thing that makes China like the core manufacturer of the world, a lot of that stuff will remain with China in the foreseeable future. So the short answer is ASEAN's outlook around a strong China is positive, tempered by the fact that there won't be that much of a diversion of FDI in the near term. And secondly, the tourism angle is going to be absent. And final point, sorry, I forgot to mention one thing, is that the RCEP. RCEP certainly is a shot in the arm that, at the end of 2020, we saw a bit of a pushback against this narrative of deglobalization, where China and a bunch of non-ASEAN countries joined hands with ASEAN to create this regional bloc. I think that's encouraging. I like the fact that the UK and the Chinese are also interested in joining the CPTPP. So that gives me some hope for ASEAN's future with respect to supply chain and FDI.
So relative to the world at the moment, China and ASEAN look relatively positive in growth and also outlook in terms of being willing to somewhat engage. I mean, there's nationalism, but I think you're right. Both the usual comprehensive economic partnership and other signs are that they're willing to open up certain barriers. Okay, can I turn to a question I think might, in a way, help be interesting from both angles? This is the Chinese vaccine diplomacy. Tikki, when you said about economic vaccine nationalism, one of the factors you were hoping, and I'm also hoping that Singapore and COVAX will, separately step up and so fill that gap. But if that gap persists, it seems that China is more than willing to supply that to many countries, including Indonesia, many countries around us. Do you see this as a factor for the health issue? And for Taimur, if I could ask you to indulge in a bit of economic and sort of political analysis of that relationship. How, if ASEAN starts to depend on China's vaccines, how much do you think this will affect the overall influence of China?
Yeah, I mean, my short answer is this issue about, or the perception that the Chinese vaccines are not as good as those developed in the West. I think that's completely misplaced. I mean, those vaccines are as effective and equally safe as any of the other vaccines, and may even have advantages in terms of the number of doses, in terms of
I'm
the
sure.
required
Yes.
storage, etc., etc. And perhaps in relation to your question, most importantly, and I'm going a little bit beyond my own area of expertise here, is that China's well proven track record of being able to deliver things, infrastructure projects, for example, in record time, makes me believe that their ability to ramp up vaccine production would be a very important factor in overcoming this inequity and this imbalance in vaccine supply globally, especially to the developing countries. I mean, those of you who are political scientists or international relations experts like you, Simon, will say, well, this is part of China's soft global diplomacy. Hey, but hey, if it saves lives, what have you got to say? So I think it will be playing a very important role in terms of meeting that gap in supply.
Thank you, Tikki. Taimur, would you have a comment on this?
So, I mean, it seems to me that the Chinese have been trying very hard in the last 1 year to become like the beacon of globalization, just as it sees, deglobalization tendencies and nationalism propping up in the West. Uh, Trust me, the Americans are also watching that played by the Chinese, and they want to make sure that that doesn't happen. So that great power rivalry of, sort of the battle for influence, battle for relevance, will continue. Let's hope that we can benefit out of it as opposed to it becoming a lose-lose proposition for us here in Asia. I remember with General Luhut a couple of years ago in Indonesia, and he said that, and I think many others have said that, is that ASEAN countries should not be put in a position to choose one or the other. I mean, we want to do trade and we want to have military cooperation with both China and the US. So it seems to me that the importance of Chinese FDI, even countries that are not in the best of relationship vis-a-vis China, are still, completely, totally enthralled of that. So you think about a country like India, which has had significant deterioration in relationship with China in recent years. Still, without Chinese FDI into the Indian tech space, you can't even think of too many major tech initiatives in India. Similarly with Australia, very tense relationship between two countries, but trade relationship, investment relationship remain extremely tight. And I think the fact that the CAI, the Agreement on Investment between European Union and China, got signed toward the end of December tells you again that just by virtue of being very large, China has sort of developed this economic symbiosis with a great many parts of the world, Africa, European Union, ASEAN, and others. And as a result, all of those regions, just in their self-interest, it's nothing to do with ideology or appeasement. It's just in their self-interest. It is, it behooves them to sort of have more than sort of, the US style, relationship, a little deeper. European Union is a classic example. $140 billion of EU investments reside in China, and $120 billion of Chinese investment reside in European Union. These two economies, just because of that, have $250 billion worth of reasons to remain in good relationship. And I think the same stands for ASEAN and China.
Thank you, Taimur. Let's move on to the next question in the list, and that's from Andrew Wiltshire. It's a question I think Dr. Pangestu can answer best. This is about vaccine passports. I think, Tikki, you mentioned how there's a moral, legal, ethical issue about access and whether you kind of force or pressure people to have vaccines. And this question in a way touches on that because a lot of people will say about international cooperation is that you basically will be easier to travel when you have vaccine passports, and you can't if you don't, virtually.
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of international cooperation and going back to where I used to work, I think this is a clear example of where the WHO should play a leading role. You will remember these little yellow vaccine passports that we all used to have. When we go to Africa, we needed a yellow fever jab, for example.
Yes.
But unfortunately, I think because of all the issues that I mentioned, we are far from reaching consensus on whether a vaccine passport would be possible universally across all countries. Because the countries have different contexts. They are dealing with the pandemic at different stages. They are deploying vaccines at different stages. But it doesn't mean that the international dialogue shouldn't begin. And the WHO is an organization that its core function is setting norms and standards. So I think it should begin dialogue to bring countries together to start discussing what might be the criteria that would be acceptable to most or to all countries for having such vaccine passport. But it's probably too early in the vaccine deployment scenario. But as things develop, I think things will become clearer by the middle of this year, perhaps.
Simon, I just want to add
Go
one
ahead.
point to that. So I think that even before WHO get its act together, which I don't think it will, I agree with Professor Pangestu on that. So IATA, the International Airline Travel Association, I think will be the first organization to use their app to create a sort of a global information sharing system where any traveler within the IATA app can prove that they have been vaccinated in a 3 to 6 month horizon, and which would then open up various international travel channels for them. I believe Air New Zealand is the first one, which is sort of trying to get the pilot going. But airlines are so desperate. They will, in their own sort of existential needs, have to come up with a solution, and they can't wait for 2022, 2023. They have to get something done this summer or early fall.
Yeah, but I think, for me, and again, not expert here, but you're correct about the desperation of airlines, which therefore as a regulator makes me a bit nervous about depending on a airline industry driven system. Because, they don't have the same fundamental interest as the health authorities. And so in a sense of whether you trust a vaccination passport, if it's done by the airlines, I think this will be a big question. I think Tikki is right that we'll have to figure out this as it comes along, as the vaccines develop. That's my guess. Now,
Yeah, I mean, if Kishore was in this conversation, he would say that multilateralism is still really the way to go. Although I appreciate Taimur's point about IATA playing an important role. At the end of the day, it's a norm-setting organization where all 193 countries are at the table that will sort of probably have the best chance of pushing something like this through. But at this point in time, it's probably a bit too early to see that happening.
yeah, I think also our Prime Minister has called for the idea that WHO is somebody who needs to test and verify a lot of the testing. That's I see it's a fundamental call, but it's something that's really another gap in terms of trying to get travel flowing again. It'll be a big challenge coming out. Now, if I may, I'll close off because we're running out of time. First, to allow you to have whatever comments you feel that you wish to make, because sometimes I don't know enough of the topics to even ask the right question. But if I could give a specific question, I hope you will try to answer too. For Taimur, it is the other issues. Do you think the Singapore budget has done enough to really help the Singapore economy, both domestically and to re-engineer itself to move a step forward? Or should we expect more measures and hope for more measures later in the year? To Tikki, Dr. Pangestu, sorry, I should ask you, Taimur mentioned how Singapore isn't the fastest and the most should we be trying to go faster? And do you feel that this resistance to vaccines is going to grow in Singapore, or do you think the level of trust in the Singapore government to move ahead at a fairly deliberate pace is the right one? I'm waiting for my shot since I'm 60 now, but I'm happy to wait. So if I could ask you both to hopefully deal those questions, but also close off on anything you want to. First with Taimur, then the last with Dr. Pangestu, please.
So Simon, I think that the second half of this year could well turn out to be, at least from an economic growth perspective, a decent year. We will see encouraging vaccination numbers coming up in the next few months. Let's keep our fingers crossed that all these variants are not going to spoil the party, especially some of the studies we're seeing out of Israel in terms of the efficacy of the vaccine is very encouraging, and hopefully that will continue to galvanize sentiment toward normalization. And the sort of stimulus, especially that the Americans are sort of talking about, we could see a major pickup in global activity in the second half of this year, even if travel is not fully restored. Just from a trade perspective, it could be very, very good. And that sort of brings me to the question that you have, because they're related. That is Singapore's budget adequate? Well, if you believe that we are ripe for a second half of the year global takeoff, then of course the budget is fully adequate, and it is sort of being prudent in not going for broad-based support measures, but trying to become much more targeted and only looking at industries that are peculiar and need urgent support, as opposed to every single industry, because at some point, some industries probably will have to go through some creative destruction because their demand simply will not come back, even when the dust settles. And then you might as well start, figuring out how to clean up those balance sheets or how to adjust or consolidate those sectors. Singapore has its eggs in a couple of very interesting baskets. We talked about sustainability earlier. On the green initiative side, Singapore is getting pretty serious and is going to become quite the player in the region and a leader, in my view. Also in the area of fintech, my sector, Singapore seems to have developed a bit of a comparative advantage. The biggest, most interesting fintechs in the ASEAN space seem to want to be part of the Singaporean ecosystem over and over again. And I think we will see good developments in this area. Singapore has spent the last 2 decades trying to become a powerhouse in pharmaceutical, turning out to be a very prescient move. It's a good thing to do. And this whole move toward food security and other measures. So I think Singapore is certainly preparing for tomorrow, not just looking at yesterday, which was all about, travel, tourism, and electronics.
Thank you, Taimur. Tikki?
Yeah, Simon, it's my considered view that you can call it slow, okay, that the fairly slow, deliberate approach of Singapore is actually one of the main reasons for it being one of the safest countries in the world. A prudent, calibrated, and importantly, evidence-driven set of policies and strategies. Absolutely critical. And I would like to cite here Foreign Minister Balakrishnan, who I think more than a year ago went on CNBC and said that the 3 key pillars of dealing with the pandemic is good governance, a robust healthcare system, and importantly, social capital. I think those 3 are really the mainstays of Singapore's success, and I think something that perhaps many other countries could have learned from. Thank you.
Well, thank you both. I think you both ended on a very positive note about Singapore. And as the chairman of the Singapore Institute of International Affairs, the Singapore part of me thanks you. But I think, want just to be a bit humble. At the start of the year, last year, as I said, we didn't see this coming. And we started off dealing with the pandemic very well, as you recall. Then there were darker times. We, at the present time, seem to be handling both the pandemic quite well, the vaccination rollouts. I think Tikki has given his personal view and endorsement of the pace and the level of trust, social capital that's being used. But I think Taimur also was very correct in terms of the budget. We went through so many budgets last year, I can't remember the names anymore. And this year, I think Taimur was given it, again, a very high mark. So we seem to be on the right track. But as I said, when I look around the world, either we've been especially blessed or lucky, like a force field, and or we will face other dark times and hopefully rise to the challenge. I'm afraid there's no more time for questions. I do want to thank both speakers, not just for the positive turn at the end, but really their deep analysis of 2 areas which matter greatly, the health and the economy, but yet many of us are amateurs, including me. So I've learned again a great deal from each of them. I want to thank them on your behalf as the audience, because sadly we can't meet in person and clap. And we hope that we'll tune in for more sessions. And sometime in 2021, we'll return to either a hybrid, where some of us can meet in person and interact and share ideas. Meanwhile, thank you again. Please keep safe and be well.